For decades, the Jackson family has been one of the most famous families on Earth. Millions know the music, millions know the scandals, millions know the success. But very few people know the story that existed long before the fame, long before the platinum records, long before Neverland, long before the world knew the name Michael Jackson. Because when researchers, genealogists, and DNA specialists began tracing the deeper ancestry of the Jackson family, they uncovered a story that stretched across centuries. And what they found changed the way many people viewed one of America's most famous families. The story begins in Gary, Indiana. That is where the Jackson family built their legacy. A small house, 9 children, a strict father, a determined mother, and a dream that eventually transformed into global superstardom. To most people, this is where the Jackson story starts. But DNA and genealogical records reveal that the story actually begins much earlier, much earlier. Researchers studying African-American family histories often face a unique challenge. Many family records were lost, incomplete, or never officially documented during the era of slavery in the United States. This means tracing family lines beyond the 19th century can be incredibly difficult. Yet advances in DNA analysis have changed that. Modern genetic testing allows researchers to identify ancestral connections that would have been nearly impossible to discover only a generation ago. And when members of the Jackson family explored their ancestry, fascinating patterns began to emerge. The first major discovery involved geography. Like many African-American families, the Jackson lineage traces back to multiple regions of West and Central Africa. Genetic studies of descendants from enslaved populations in America frequently reveal ancestral ties to areas that today include Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Congo, and neighboring regions. The Jackson family's ancestry appears consistent with these broader migration patterns, but that was only the beginning. Because DNA can reveal more than geography. It can reveal survival. Every generation carries genetic echoes of the generations before it. The Jackson family's success story is often told as a story of talent. But DNA researchers sometimes describe ancestry differently. They describe it as a story of endurance. Every ancestor who survived war, displacement, disease, slavery, discrimination, and poverty contributed to the existence of future generations, including the generation that would eventually produce Michael Jackson. Think about that for a moment. The man who would become the most famous entertainer in modern history existed because countless ancestors survived circumstances that could have easily erased their family line forever. That realization alone changed how many people viewed the Jackson story, because it transformed the narrative from one family achieving fame into something much larger. A story of survival across centuries. But perhaps the most overlooked part of the Jackson story is what happened before the music. Before the world knew Michael Jackson, the family was living a life that looked very different from the one people imagine today. The Jackson family's rise to fame is often presented as an overnight success story. It wasn't. Like countless African-American families during the 20th century, they faced economic hardship, limited opportunities, and social barriers that affected entire generations. This is where ancestry becomes important, because DNA doesn't simply tell us where a family came from. It helps explain how they arrived where they are today. Many descendants of enslaved Africans lost direct access to their family histories. Names were changed, records disappeared, entire generations became difficult to trace. For decades, families often relied on stories passed down from grandparents and relatives. DNA provided something those stories couldn't always provide: evidence. And for families like the Jacksons, it helped reconnect pieces of history that had been missing for generations. As genealogists continued digging into historical records, another fascinating pattern emerged. The Jackson family, like many American families, was not defined by a single ancestry. Instead, their family history reflected centuries of migration, cultural blending, and complex historical realities. The deeper researchers looked, the more interconnected the story became. What appeared on the surface to be a single family history was actually the product of many different family histories merging over generations. This is one of the most powerful aspects of modern DNA research. It reminds us that identities are rarely simple. The labels people use today often fail to capture the complexity of what came before. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the story of the Jackson family. Interestingly, Michael Jackson himself often expressed fascination with history, identity, and family. Throughout his life, he spoke about the importance of family roots and understanding where people come from. Friends and associates frequently described Michael as someone who asked questions, a lot of questions, not just about music, but about culture, about history, about human behavior, and about the experiences that shaped people. Many fans remember the superstar. Few remember the student, the curious individual who spent countless hours reading and learning. Had today's DNA technology been available decades earlier, it is difficult to imagine Michael not being fascinated by the results. Because the discoveries weren't merely about genetics, they were about identity. And identity was something Michael spent much of his life trying to understand. Yet perhaps the most surprising revelation had nothing to do with specific percentages or regions. It had to do with timing. Researchers found that many families spend years searching for their origins because they want answers. But what DNA often provides instead is perspective. And for the Jackson family, that perspective was extraordinary. Before there was fame, there was struggle. Before there were awards, there was sacrifice. Before there was Michael Jackson, there were generations of people whose names may never appear in history books. People who worked fields. People who endured unimaginable hardships. People who raised families despite overwhelming odds. People whose stories largely disappeared from public memory. Yet their legacy remained, not in monuments, not in photographs, but in DNA. And that realization can be profoundly emotional, because it means that every success achieved by the Jackson family was built upon foundations laid by people who never received recognition themselves. As the world focused on Michael's performances, records, and achievements, a much older story existed beneath the surface. A story written long before the invention of television, long before radio, long before modern music. A story preserved in genetics. Of course, DNA cannot explain everything. It cannot tell us what an ancestor dreamed about. It cannot tell us what they feared. It cannot reveal every detail of their lives. But it can reveal connections. And sometimes those connections are enough to completely transform how a family sees itself. So why do people say the DNA findings changed everything? The answer is actually simple. Not because they uncovered a shocking secret, not because they rewrote history, but because they added depth to a story most people thought they already understood. For years, people viewed the Jackson family through the lens of celebrity, through music videos, television appearances, award shows, controversies, headlines. But DNA forced people to zoom out, to look beyond the fame, to see the generations that came before, the workers, the parents, the survivors, the people who endured hardships that modern generations can barely imagine. Suddenly, the Jackson family became more than a celebrity family. They became part of a much larger story, a story shared by millions of families across America and around the world, a story about migration, a story about resilience, a story about survival, and ultimately a story about legacy. Because DNA revealed something many people forget. No one begins their story alone. Every life is built upon countless lives that came before it. Every achievement rests upon sacrifices made by previous generations. And in the case of Michael Jackson, perhaps no statement captures that reality better. The king of pop may have stood alone on stage, but he never stood alone in history. Behind him stood centuries of ancestors whose struggles, sacrifices, and perseverance eventually made his existence possible. For the Jackson family, the discoveries reinforced something that many historians already understood. The story of African American families is not simply a story of hardship. It is also a story of resilience, of adaptation, of persistence, and ultimately, of triumph. When fans think of the Jackson family today, they often think about music, the Jackson 5, Michael Jackson, Janet Jackson, world tours, record sales, global fame. But DNA reveals a different perspective, one that begins centuries earlier. One that reminds us that fame represents only the most recent chapter of a much longer story. A story carried through generations. A story preserved through ancestry. A story written into the DNA itself. And perhaps that is the most remarkable discovery of all. Because what DNA revealed about the Jackson family wasn't simply where they came from. It revealed how many people came before them, how many sacrifices were made, how many obstacles were overcome, and how an ordinary family history eventually produced one of the most extraordinary legacies the world has ever seen. When viewed through that lens, the Jackson family's story becomes something much bigger than celebrity. It becomes a story about history, a story about survival, a story about identity, and a story that continues to evolve with every new discovery. Because long before the world knew the name Michael Jackson, history had already been preparing the path that would eventually lead to him. And DNA helped reveal just how incredible that journey truly was. What changed everything wasn't a shocking secret. It wasn't a hidden scandal. It wasn't a mystery finally solved. It was something far more powerful. The realization that behind one of the most famous families in history stood centuries of forgotten stories. Stories of courage, stories of sacrifice, stories of survival. And without those stories, there would never have been a Jackson legacy at all.